Alright guys, so I've probably just released the reaction to the Call of Duty trailer for the new game, which I don't really know if I'll be getting to this because I haven't got like the last six or whatever. But yeah, I was a video was brought to my attention, which basically kind of like I follow a gentleman under the name of Vorsh, and he's a very good kind of like middle ground to get all of your kind of leftist politics and a good representation of the left. Vorsh is Chad, he's boss. Like if his destruction and his list of bodies that he's left behind is not enough to convince you, then watch his streams because that's fun too. Video gaming is fun and he's good at that. But we go into another video that was suggested by one of the commenters, and it's apparently a really high profile gamer under the name of Echo something, I don't know, Echelon Gamers, I don't, no one cares. And he has a very interesting take on the new Call of Duty game and its apparent message. Now, I started watching maybe a minute of this and I thought I have to do a react to this because it's such a petri dish gaming world, and this new kind of like celebrity culture of like Z-list celebrities who are like really influential, earn a high ton of money and so on, yet still don't really take 5 minutes out of their days to just educate themselves on random topics, despite their financial needs exceedingly met. The time that they have, probably a lot more than the most people. And again, the call for educating people, spreading good information and good faith information is pretty high right now, especially when we're talking about the fact that the world is in the pandemic stage, and we've seen how misinformation can basically result in a lot of death. I know people personally who are anti-mask and have suffered as a result. We're talking like casualties. We're not talking like, got a bit of a headache, got a bit of a dry cough. No, we're talking casualties. So it's interesting to see how people are still in this day and age promoting and pandering to fascism, despite the fact that it has real life implications, it has real life damages, and for the most part, like, these people will never be held accountable. I just don't understand how people sleep at night. But let's not go into a critique because my commentaries go on for way too long, and let's try and just give this guy a benefit of the doubt. But I'm being dead serious from the first minute. It is very clear where this guy is going with these conspiracy theories. Right, so the video is by a channel under the name of Upper Echelon Gamers there. Sounds like a very inclusive group, and yeah, let's just go straight into it, man, because otherwise this will be a half-an-hour video and I hate doing long videos.
Today is going to be an intense video. I'll be discussing historical events, contemporary politics, graphic and violent video games, as well as connections between real-world chaos and fictional narratives. If there was ever a video I created that would be demonetized or suppressed, it's this one. So if you like the content, please subscribe and share the material. Call of Duty is a monument of gaming success. The game has been produced and sold around the globe for 17 years. It is one of the most profitable entertainment franchises to ever exist throughout history, and has impacted the lives of millions, even hundreds of millions of different people. To some, it is a simple time consumption activity with no message or value. To others, it is a career, a hobby, or a favorable way to socially relax. But to one final group, it is a cultural phenomenon that has real-world social impact and must be monitored, modified, and sculpted in order to adhere to a new age of modern equity, equality, and representation. This atmosphere dates back a number of years, but can be best exemplified by articles from major news publications such as the following: Call of Duty World War II's diversity is nothing more than marketing. This piece would go on to claim that the game whitewashes history, explores a tokenistic representation of the real-world stories it seeks to portray, while being an example of sexist development strategies with shallow and misogynistic undertones. The game was effectively lambasted for trying to adhere to shifting social standards of inclusion and diversity while doing so poorly, but these criticisms were just the beginning, and over the next few years, Call of Duty would become one of the industry's most notable controversy marketing provocateurs, even if that controversy was, more often than not, contrived or shallow upon final release. This, however, appears to be changing. The latest trailer for Call of Duty Cold War has just officially unveiled, and despite this 2-minute video being entirely void of gameplay, completely without context, and depicting nothing in terms of actual story framework, it by itself is already a scathing commentary on modern social discourse and political activism. The game's legitimate narrative may be something benign or uninteresting, but for 2 minutes, Activision Blizzard has brought a highly charged, compelling, and critical message to a demographic that most likely fails to consider these events in any legitimate contemporary context. I'll have the full trailer linked down below for those that have not seen it. If you haven't, you can pause the video right now and go watch it. With that out of the way, we can discuss what seems to be a completely innocuous 2-minute promotional trailer to some, but is far more relevant and integrated within modern political and social discourse than many realize. Without further ado, Call of Duty Cold War, the collision course of controversy.
So, yeah, nothing to comment on. I mean, that I haven't commented on in terms of like the history of like video gaming, the radicalization of youth, and the propaganda obviously used to recruit people at a young age into the military, which is one of my biggest contentions. But you know, there's various Democrats who have posed the notion that the idea of recruiting people is getting younger and younger, and we seem to have no, or at least America seems to have no limitations as to how expendable, it views its population. In the fact that, you know, to be recruiting at that younger age, like, we should be at the stage in 2020 where we're at de-escalation. You know, we have the means of communication, we have the means of connectivity, and you know, there's just no excuse where historically, you know, language barriers, cultures, all of that kind of like you know, stuff that is trivial now. We have better understanding, and the differences are actually far exceeded by, you know, the similarities and commonality that all man shares. So it'll be interesting going forward to see just how, you know, video gaming has been taken as such a overtly political tool for people's real life kind of activity beyond, I don't know, for me personally, beyond kind of like workout inspiration and just, you know, having overly masculine and like, you know, homoerotic body types, etc., that helped me get the physique that I did in my later age. No, I couldn't really say that I go to Call of Duty or I go to video games to get any kind of like real rounded world view. No, I just go to Wikipedia for that, bro. I do my reading. So, you know, already there's a demographic of people who prefer, obviously, again, I'm not going to judge. There's people learn differently. Some people love to read. I absolutely hate to read. The only reason I have to read is because, well, I'm a leftist. I'm up against fascism, and for the most part, you know, articulation is our best weapon. You know, theory is our best weapon. History, and, you know, an encyclopedic knowledge of it, and good critical thinking of, you know, people's policies, foreign policies, conduct towards certain countries, and escalations and situations, etc. That is just generally what being on the left is about. Learning from history and, you know, progressing humanity to have better human rights. So, you know, I'm not gonna, if I sound too snobby throughout this, forgive me, but I have very little respect for the QAnon, you know, anti-vaxxers, anti-mask type conspiracy theorists whose sole kind of like education base is entertainment media.
Most important place to begin is Yuri Bezmenov. Yuri Bezmenov, born 1939, was a KGB press and propaganda agent. Active from 1963 to 1986, he is most famous for his defection to the United States and subsequent publication of information about Soviet active measures, which were psychological warfare tactics to destabilize the United States from within. His discussions are available widely online, and his material on subversion has become an educational archive which is used in teaching curriculums as high as Yale and Harvard. This trailer is a series of graphic...
It's trying his hardest to legitimize Yuri just a little bit too much there, especially by noting the fact that Yale and, I can't remember Harvard, the apex of where his kind of like contribution towards anti-communism came from. And for those who don't obviously understand, Yuri is an anti-communist. So it's very different to Edward Snowden, who still, for all terms and purposes, still loves his country. Tracy Manning, again, still loves her country, but for the most part, the country hates them. Bezmenov was, disillusioned by the communist empire, disillusioned by Soviet Russia, etc. And I could go into a long tangent about whether or not the Soviet Union was communist, whether or not the Soviet Union was Marxist and was following the teachings of Engels and Marx, etc. But it's just a bit nitpicky. So again, I just want to point out the fact that we're giving Yuri Bezmenov, who is a known authoritarian and probably has some questionable views towards the liberal values that we've come to accept today, in terms of equal rights for everyone, LGBT, marginalized people of color, women, etc. He probably has some interesting things to say about that. But let's see what our gentleman has taken from the video.
Cold War footage, superimposed atop commentary from one of his lectures, discussing a timeline for the destabilization of Western democracy during the Cold War period. He describes a very slow process: demoralization, 15 to 20 years to demoralize an entire nation, then destabilization, focusing on the essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems, and finally, crisis, with a violent transition of power, structure, and economy, while normalizing the tactics utilized to overthrow the free world. These tactics were real, the stories were true, and the final chilling comparison he makes is directly to the United States, while the message, "Know your history or be doomed," is displayed on screen.
Again, we're already kind of going into very fictitious kind of like regions here. The theories aren't real. They're speculation. They are, anti-communist propaganda at best. And obviously, in terms of the materialization of Yuri Bezmenov's theories and Yuri Bezmenov's assertion that the communist governments and Russians and so on are coming to, overthrow America through insurgent, is rather hysterical because of the nature in which America finds itself at war with the Middle East for trying to do exactly that. Insert themselves into foreign geopolitical problems that they had no place in. So it's just interesting to see how the lack of history education in like the States has really contributed to the perpetuation and the continuation of anti-communist hysteria. So obviously I don't want to project too much and I don't want to predict too much, but obviously gentlemen saying that America is now in a situation where it's demoralized and, corrupt, and it's been infiltrated, and it's not the America of old. Now, America's been through a depression. The economic crashes have been a few. We had the Vietnam War. Before that, World War II was pretty much a stain on a lot of societies. So I'm wondering what cataclysmic level event is this gentleman talking about, or at least referring to, because man, I must have been asleep for the last 20 years or so, because I don't really think much has happened since 9/11. So let's have a look.
Yuri Bezmenov spoke about tactics employed by the Soviet Union, and to understand why this trailer alone, with no further context, is already on a collision course for widespread controversy, we need to understand what the Soviet Union really was. The Soviet Union is rooted in the October Revolution of 1917, when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian provisional government. However, it only became a consolidated version of actual Russian government after 1922. The Soviet Union followed an official state ideology of Marxist-Leninism with an essential component of state socialism. The core dominating pillar of its governance was the party, and its assured status as a sole ruling group. The terminology here is important to outline correctly, but also somewhat complicated. Communist, socialist, and Marxist are all semi-accurate terms to describe the Soviet Union, but in the time since, those definitions have become largely polluted, and are spoken of more in the framework of a social media argument than anything else.
There's so much to nitpick there from a historical point of view. Well, for a fact, this is another kind of like lazy argument of certain pseudo historians. The idea that there's no distinction between socialism and Marxism and communism, etc. Like Marx, I don't know how many people haven't like the Communist Manifesto is not that many pages. You won't get shot and you won't get arrested for buying a copy and just educating yourself, but there is a distinction between socialism and communism. The distinction is quite distinct. Like, you cannot confuse the two. They're not that similar. Like, one's still working on on a slightly capitalistic nature of still promoting free market, etc. But while promoting high taxes, infrastructure investment, education investment, so that you can bring the social conscience of the masses up in order to provide the kind of like consensus, populace of thinking that would lead to a civil communist society where people understood that their contributions have much wider impacts. The contributions to the society actually have a great deal of potential in terms of improving certain things such as inequalities, healthcare, education, all of these things that we now have come to enjoy because of historical advancements in technology, literature, democracy, all of these things, medicine, we've come to enjoy now, and for the most part do take quite for granted. In terms, again, trying to establish power for a particular elite at the top, very inconsistent with Lenin's actual practice. Lenin unfortunately wasn't in practice, wasn't ruling for that long before he met an untimely demise, in which Stalin would then unfortunately take over in a very brutal fashion. And Lenin obviously kind of like warned against Stalin and his tendencies before he kind of like passed on to the next side. So the idea that Stalin unfortunately has become so synonymous with communism and Marxist theory is such a stupid interpretation of history, because of the fact that the sole kind of like the sole practitioner closest that we have to being able to get to a position of power in which he could start kind of like deploying all of his left-leaning kind of like policies of like giving land back to the masses, producing education, producing evolution of the society to a point in which society was a lot more a lot more for the workers and less more for the monarchy and aristocracy. To conflate that level of complex history, especially from 1917 up to the Second World War, is just because obviously the First World War is what led to the weakening of Russia and the ability to actually overthrow the Tsars and so on. In terms of obviously this particular interpretation, it's very lazy and it doesn't really do much justice to the audience when you kind of like don't actually give them the context that they need as to what communism is, what socialism is, what Marxism is. The use of Russia as the sole center of what communist and Marxist theory is about is really disingenuous.
In order to make the connection between real-world events and this one simple trailer, however, we need to dig rather deep. It all starts with recent American civil unrest, and
I really hope you're going to dig a lot deeper than the first extract of a Wikipedia page.
this is the point where I need to communicate clearly that I will simply be showing and discussing statements and positions from existing public figures that are publicly available online, and I do not intend to advocate for further action against any of these individuals or the causes that they represent. I am merely drawing correlations between the Cold War trailer and real-world events. Please do not use this video or the statements highlighted as a reason to participate in any illegal or malicious action whatsoever. I do.
Again, bro, you know your video is fascist. Like, you know it's fascist because of the fact that you know people are going to watch this video, take on the Cold War communist hysteria. And we're going to see the same sorts of, you know, aggressive satanic panic sort of ignorances that come with misinformation, that come with not really knowing your history, and that come with conflating, you know, current ideologies and current kind of like strives for, you know, a move away from traditionalism to some kind of cooked up conspiracy theory that, you know, was mainstream in like the 70s onwards. This, you know, the fact that you have to put a disclaimer basically saying if there's any mass shootings, then, you know, please don't look at my video as the inspiring kind of like source point for that is a bit disingenuous. Like, I take responsibility for my words. Like, I will say certain things, like certain people who, you know, society doesn't necessarily like are still deserving of human rights and deserve their day in court. I take responsibility for those words. Don't be a wuss. Like, don't be a testicle. Like, just take responsibility for your words, bro. You clearly have interpreted a 2-minute clip with your own worldview in mind. So just take responsibility for that.
Do not condone or support that behavior. Again, I merely want to showcase why the Call of Duty Cold War trailer is a scathing commentary on the current activism that has swept across the United States in recent months. To understand where all of this started, we must go back to July 2013 and the acquittal of a police officer who had been involved in a tragic shooting. The situation sparked national conversations about police brutality and racism in the United States, from the incident itself right up until the officer was released, but more importantly, in response to this event, 3 women formed an organization called Black Lives Matter, a phrase now shouted in city and town streets across the entire country. These women were...
I'm not sure how the death of Trayvon Martin was tragic. You had George Zimmerman, who was, you know, a jumped up kind of like neighborhood police officer, basically running around on a power trip with his gun, and saw a black guy wearing a hoodie and decided that he was a threat. Now, to paint that as tragic is already dismissing the long history of racism in the United States. If we're going to be giving Yuri Bezmenov some kind of credentials here and some kind of authority on, you know, American society, then I think you will give the Black Lives Matter the same level of authority and, you know, introspect on American society and what the experiences of certain communities, particularly marginalized communities, actually are. So I'm wondering if he's actually going to go into an in-depth explanation as to why Black Lives Matter is a movement and why Trayvon Martin is one of many reasons, you know, one of many reasons for this particular movement to exist. Because let's be honest, this particular rhetoric and this particular energy has not been existent just because of Trayvon Martin. You know, this has been a long history within the African American community, and Trayvon Martin was the end, I guess the camel that broke the straw that broke the camel's back, I believe. And to paint it out as just tragic and then all of a sudden this movement started is slightly ahistorical.
Named Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. Reading from the official history page on their activist website, which is the homepage for Black Lives Matter as an organization, we can see the following. In 2013, 3 radical black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, created a black-centered political will and movement-building project called #Black Lives Matter. The project is now a member-led global network of more than...
So, you got to notice, the guy said that he's just going to be reading particular extracts from pages and so on, and not really throwing opinions onto there. He then goes on to highlight radical and political. but we're still meant to believe that he's giving an unbiased kind of like correlation between certain events and Yuri Bezmenov's speech. Now, you've already kind of shot yourself in the foot there, because by highlighting that, you're indicating that this particular movement is of radical political nature. And, you know, radical, when we think of radical, we tend to associate it with people who are troublemakers. We tend to associate it with people who don't necessarily fit into society's ideology, society's traditionalism, and society's propriety. And this is funny because when we look at the mission statement for Black Lives Matter, or at least even just a self-explanatory title for Black Lives Matter, considering the history of African Americans in the America and the fact that Black lives have definitely taken more of a hit in comparison to any race in that particular region of the world, is rather self-telling. The fact that you think that that is radical, the fact that you think that is political, not the actual death of these particular, the disproportional deaths of these particular group of people, is rather telling, is rather biased, and it's already painting a picture as to what you kind of think of black people. So let's let the gentleman elaborate even more, because just wanted to point out that he thinks that it's a radical political movement, not a political reaction to radical kind of devaluing of people's human rights for centuries.
And 40 chapters. Our members organize and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes. Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. These paragraphs are important because they...
Again, the highlighting, Black Lives Matter is an ideological political intervention. Doesn't highlight the fact that our systemically and intentionally target for demise. He doesn't highlight that bit, because that bit's not quite important as the fact that this is a political movement and an ideology. Imagine being a rape victim and then forming a group of people who think that rape is wrong, because ultimately taking black lives unjustly is wrong, and then calling that group who has a problem with rape ideological political intervention and a radical political movement. The notion is that you find the idea that people should not be raped radical, that you find the fact that people are saying that black people should not be disproportionately shot based on stereotypes and the threatening nature in which America has basically depicted African American males in particular. You believe that sympathies towards that is radical. When they talk about radical, especially these particular three ladies, they're talking about the fact that even within the black community, where, you know, black community is quite traditionally conservative, very highly religious, and for the most part, if they probably weren't experiencing the high levels of discrimination and, you know, targeting that they were, they probably would vote in the same fashion as Trump voters, because for the most part, our education as a mass has not gotten to the point where we see through charlatans like Trump. So it's interesting because these three, we have a lady who's gay, a lady who is, I believe, in a relationship with a trans woman, and I'm trying to remember what the other lady is known for, but these are very radical existences, even outside of the marginalized black experience. So when we're talking about radical, we're not talking about the actual movement of Black Lives Matter. We're talking about these three in particular. And you somehow managed to conflate the idea of being radical with the actual statement as a movement is interesting.
Outline that Black Lives Matter from an organizational standpoint is framed as a political movement. It is a political movement being projected across the nation as millions shout the words at anyone who will listen, and more importantly, anyone who will not listen alike. Yuri Bezmenov has long, well-articulated speeches. He outlines how the subversion tactics will take many forms. One such item is the promotion of social workers who will eventually erode the standard social links of peer-to-peer community interaction, something that aligns with the existing push for police officers to be replaced with social workers, while defunding the police force either partially or entirely. This is a radical idea that is rejected by most American citizens, yet some cities and politicians are forging ahead with the concept regardless. Yuri Bezmenov discusses with clarity.
Just for some highlight there, and I'm not saying that people's opinions do not matter. People's opinions do matter. All opinions matter. But when we're talking about obviously the fact that the majority of Americans reject the idea of defunding the police and the intervention of social policies and stuff like that. America, again, he's neglecting the fact that America is a society based on systemic discrimination for the longest while, a catering to an upper echelon and the kind of maintaining of that upper echelon by creating this false idea of freedom, this false idea of social mobility, this false idea of equality under the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And still till up until 1964, racial groups hadn't had the ability to all be represented politically. And, up till now, racial groups who aren't white or who aren't from, particularly rich neighborhoods or so on, disproportionately are affected by criminality, shootings, and unlawful killings, particularly by the police. So, again, it's just such a lack of history and such a lack of context that is being provided to conflate these correlations between groups and Bezmenov's speech. When we're talking about social services and so on, it is known and it is proven that intervention is better than a cure. It is proven that when you actually take into considerations the social kind of ills that are affecting particular communities, poverty being one of the biggest kind of indicators whether or not someone has the likelihood of falling into criminality, is really telling, because where societies have taken that into consideration, crime has demonstratively decreased. Scotland is an example. Scotland, in comparison to London, was one of the places in which was labeled one of the most murderous places in the UK. It was the murderous place and the most murderous place in the UK, especially where gang violence was concerned. In Europe, it was one of the worst places to live for just violence, crime, and physical assault. With an addressal of systemic issues, poverty issues, and youth issues, Scotland has been able to pretty much decrease that to the point where now the UK London kind of rivals it in terms of its criminal stats. And this is not the only example. The examples where incarceration as well, Norway is an example, incarceration is treated not as a punishment, but an actual way of rehabilitating certain people's mindsets, has demonstrated that the reoffending rate decreases as you take rehabilitation more seriously and you move away from this punishment idea. So again, Yuri Bezmenov is a known authoritarian. He believes in policing people. He believes in police as a force, as a way of basically having the will of the state pushed upon the people. So this is something that he is always going to believe in, and he's always going to try and belittle the demonstrable benefits of social work. So that's interesting that somehow you've managed to miss that.
The tactic of sowing distrust between those that are tasked with protecting the population and the citizens themselves, an erosion of the journalistic process, and numerous other social realities that many see today and do not even reconsider because they have been normalized.
I don't really understand how police corruption is not something that they do themselves. It is well known that the KKK, collaborated with the American police historically. It is well known that the police as well have been infiltrated by certain hate groups that have affiliations to white supremacy and neo-Nazis. We can still see today the collusion between, or at least the kind of like collaboration and the friendly nature between the Proud Boys and the police. The Proud Boys is a designated hate group, but the police seem to show more empathy towards their particular presence than non-violent protesters, who they have all of the liberal notions to pepper spray, baton, pretty much push over, and, you know, crack a 75-year-old man's head. So if there's been distrust that's been sowed into the, you know, into the perception of the police, I'm pretty sure that's because the police warrant that. Like, particularly from marginalized communities. It's great when, you know, you're getting social commentary from someone who isn't educated on the particular matter, but furthermore, we'll never have to experience the disproportional rates in which the police act in an aggressive nature. So to them, this is trivial. You know, this experience is trivial to other people. They will never have to experience it, so it's not really much of an issue to them. But protests obviously kind of like them, I guess, arouse an obligation for people in better positions to try and do something to hold their police accountable and to try and, you know, help better the human condition or circumstances for people in marginalized positions, people of color, women, trans women, sex workers. But ultimately, a lot of people don't want to do that. They are too lazy, they are too comfortable, and they're too complacent in their particular place of privilege to understand that. So, you know, conspiracy theories like this are they are absolutely funded. They are absolutely peddled because they are excuses for, to be frank, upper white society to ignore the kind of disproportional dangers that they perpetuate and continue and uplift. It's not the best commentary so far.
X, now defected KGB propaganda agent who worked within a Marxist, socialist, communist-oriented federation, disclosing, word for word, the tactics that are utilized to destabilize a nation. And this trailer features him,
A nation that's still standing.
a previously mainstream figure of sorts, but not at the scale to which Call of Duty can propel him, as a commentator on the importance of knowing your history. On July 23rd...
Again, one key sentence that's been repeated in that particular trailer, but this gentleman doesn't know his history. It's ironic. The game, and which is why I don't know what stance everyone seems to be thinking the game is taking. I still have yet to see it, but the game obviously is saying know your history. Now, that's a classic line within African American communities because of the fact that their history has been pretty much illegal. Like, slaves were not allowed to communicate in their own language. They weren't allowed to practice their own religious rituals. They were indoctrinated into white Christendom and all of that good stuff. All cultural practices associated with their home country were pretty much penalized and ended really badly for those found practicing it. And, you know, this notion in which people kind of like have a political theory because there's a bit of a, I don't know, a bit of a bother, a bit of a hindrance, a bit of an annoyance, a nuisance in their life, it's so pathetic. Because at the end of the day, there are actual people who are experiencing disproportionate amount of discriminations. You particularly, and I'm not even going to say in terms of like my racial kind of like assumptions about the gentleman speaking, but it's interesting just how when people get to a privileged position, the human rights, the experiences, and the disproportionate amount of struggle certain people have to deal with become irrelevant. It's an interesting quality I've noticed in people once they get to a particular position of power and privilege.
3rd, 2015, Patrisse Cullors gives an interview to the Real News Network and answers a series of questions. At the 7-minute mark, she says the following.
I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
This is two founding members of a political group who are self-professed, trained Marxists. They lead a clear...
Mic drop. There's it. So our gentleman's idea of, I guess, an opposing side, or at least the demagogue in which he needs to kind of like point the finger of blame at, is Marxism. And this is a demonstration of how the American system of education has utterly failed its wider demographic in not painting a more transparent and a more kind of, I guess, inclusive picture of what just information is. Like, for most who don't understand, Marxism is just an ideology, or at least an economic ideology and criticism of how capitalism is ultimately very exploitative, and will often end in various revolts and so on when the workers are not really valued and they are pretty much belittled at every point in terms of being able to better their circumstances, being able to better their work environment, demand for higher pay, demand for better environmental factors within the workplace so that they don't get, bad lungs from working in a mine all day or working in a coal mine all day. Like, Marxism is not some kind of satanic group. It's not, and even then, like, I'm kind of guilty of my own kind of like accusations there, because even Satanism is not what everyone portrays it out to be. But it's not the satanic panic that everyone thinks it is, particularly in the Americas, because we can see in America that when you go to Trump rallies, when you go to majority of Americans, all they know that is socialism is bad. So we've had InfoWars, we've had various right-wing media such as Fox News really color that up with portrayals of Venezuela's kind of like civil unrest, issues with the economy, poverty and stuff like that. Again, this is as redundant take as if I went to is it Hollywood Boulevard and took a picture of all of the homeless people that live there and the homeless faction of a street in which basically a shanty town has been made of homeless people. And obviously no one likes to address the fact that this is a side of capitalism that is ugly. This is a side of capitalism that is exploitative. This is a side of capitalism in which belittles humanity, or at least people's humanity and potential. And it'd be like me taking a picture of that and presenting it as the sole idea of what America and what capitalism has to present. And if a particular group of people didn't have the internet, didn't have other media outlets or alternative kind of like interpretations or outlets to understand America, they would just think capitalism is bad. Any mention of capitalism is bad. And this is the simpleness of most Americans now. They're just fed what their state basically tells them. Despite being the land of the free, they're not really that big on free thinking in comparison to other countries, which is why certain groups such as the KKK still aren't really criminalized. They aren't really a hate group, despite the fact that they've been implicated on various murders, hangings and lynchings, and of course bomb plots. So interesting.
Clearly politically driven movement, and further organizers such as the leader of Black Lives Matter for Greater New York openly advocate in the media and elsewhere positions such as the following.
Said burn it down. You said burn it down. It's time. So that makes me think that you want to burn it down.
I said if this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it.
These are messages that align.
I don't understand why he'd have a problem with that, considering his country is known for burning down particularly black neighborhoods and particularly black-run cities. Obviously, Tulsa, Oklahoma is one of the classic examples that has now been reaching mainstream media. But obviously, this gentleman seems to somehow have missed that, even though the country and the entire world was talking about it when Watchmen pretty much aired on the series. Now, in terms of obviously burning down the system, it's interesting how people have now used hyperbolic language and are taking it at face value, despite us having a long classic genre of neo-Nazis, you know, fascist reactionaries, basically saying, you know, shoot commies, you know, the belittlement of like Middle Eastern people, Muslims in particular, calling of migrants rapists and all of these things. And they understand that this is inflammatory language, and at best, like, it's racism. Like, but they will bat it off as, oh, they're just like being flamboyant, they're just being, you know, a joker, this is all jokes and stuff like that. Gentleman is very clearly saying that the burning down of a system is basically the belittlement of a system, you know, the abolition of a system, particularly a system that doesn't really value their contribution or their human rights, at least. And it seems that this person has a bit of a problem with the idea that people just don't want to be treated as second-class citizens. Interesting.
Ideologically, politically, and otherwise, with a destabilization effect. The Black Lives Matter political movement makes repeated use of the word comrade, comrade being both an archaic Spanish derivation of the word friend or ally, as well as a Soviet communist greeting utilized in Russia during the height of the USSR. Searching comrade on social media will more often than not yield an overwhelming majority of self-identifying Marxist community members. Acronyms such as ACAB, a slang pejorative for every single police officer in existence, will be frequently displayed as well, on top of repeated references to Black Lives Matter. Recall that a deliberate rift between...
So that's our link. The fact that people call each other comrade means that people are Marxist infiltrators set on destabilizing America. That is our that is our smoking gun. None of them being able to speak Russian, none of them being from Russia, most of them growing up in an American education system. I don't really understand how you've somehow come to the conflation of using the term comrade, which you can find in various American classic depictions, people calling each other comrade. It is a well-known used word in the English language. How?
Protection forces and the general public are a tactic in destabilizing a nation, a tactic pushed forward by advocates for a political movement led by two self-identifying, trained Marxist leaders. The Bolshevik Revolution in...
Again, notice how this video seems to have come out, and I don't think the gentleman has ever had any videos commenting on the fact that neo-Nazis have sent like pipe bombs and, you know, really kind of like disrupted certain communities. And again, when we're talking about burning communities, like, you know, white America is very complicit in burning of certain communities that don't pander to its racial ideology, despite being American to the core. I wonder if the gentleman has done a video regarding, obviously, the targeting of certain political figures, like terroristic targeting of certain political figures, just on a disagreement of ideology and the desire to return back to a fascist ideology in which, you know, certain morals, certain human rights, and certain way of thought are dictated, governed, and policed by religious institutions and at worst white supremacy. I highly doubt it, but it's nice to...
large part was a leftist cause, which led to the formation of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a federation backed by the Marxist-Leninism ideology, which perpetrated untold and incomprehensible atrocities against its own people. A defected KGB agent discusses these tactics at length, and
everything that, I guess, Stalin, but not necessarily Lenin. And again, this is the disproportionate kind of conflation that Americans love to make when we're talking about Russia. The fact that their human rights atrocities were so bad, and, you know, the amount of people that died under the Russian, you know, communist ideology is just abhorrent. And for the most part, that's a very conflated figure, and, you know, it's highly contested by various historic scholars. But furthermore, not to bat away like, you know, millions of figures, because 1 million is an atrocious number, but this is a country which has for the longest while belittled the fact that it houses like the deaths of over 12 million African American slaves. That is the history in which America is built upon. And then we're talking about the genocidal, approach towards the Native American, Native Indian, Native American, populace. It's hilarious when people try to show moral, moral offense at the actions of the communist society, or at least the Stalinism. When Stalinism, unfortunately, there's so many things that we could go into. We can go into the history of Stalin. We could go into the fact that Europe in itself was constantly looming on the verge of war, in comparison to America, which kind of just killed black people for lols. Russia, which was a majority kind of farmer nation, which, within the 20 years that communism kind of, thrived, or at least was the state power at the time, went from 20% literate literate nation to 80% literate nation. This hyper-industrialization was obviously to meet the demands and to meet the kind of progression of fascism in Germany, which majority of people were obviously predicting would lead to a potential Second World War. And there's not to excuse at all the atrocities that happened in Russia, but to compare that with the fact that America just thought black people were subhuman and their deaths didn't matter is it's cognitive dissonance on a new level, but that I've become too frequent with, I've become too familiar with when it comes to debating Americans.
Now, in a time when self-professed Marxists lead a political movement which advocates openly for the burning down of the existing system, Activision Blizzard releases a historical warning from...
Again, you've got to love how he's talking of the current system with such glee. He's talking of the current system with such oomph in his step. And of course, if I was, probably a straight white male in America, I would absolutely love the system. But do you know who it isn't quite nice and dandy for? Women, people of color, illegal migrants, trans people, and LGBT people. There are so many different existences and factions who demonstrate the fact that American capitalism is to benefit a particular group of people. And for the most part, they don't necessarily disagree with the module, but they disagree with the fact that discrimination is still quite prominent in how America positions itself, or at least develops itself. And the majority of these people are just asking for human rights. They're asking for the equal respect that they deserve as people under the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. It's interesting because America in itself is a liberal story. The idea of separating from a monarchy and judging a nation based on the fact that all human beings are born equal and should have an equality of opportunity. We've somehow still managed to land ourselves in a somewhat pseudo monarchy kind of module in terms of aristocracy, people with wealth, people with money, people who own land, being those to govern and dictate and enforce policies of what they thought was proper onto their citizens, or subjects really, if we're talking about the reality of what the American system is. So when this gentleman talks about obviously with such a disgruntled kind of disdain for the burning down of our system, it's a discriminatory system at best. It is a fucking racist system at worst. The fact that you don't want to burn it down says a lot about you.
From Yuri Bezmenov, pointedly saying we must never forget history. But that's not where it ends. LaShawn K. Ford, Democratic representative for the state of Illinois and open supporter of the Black Lives Matter political movement, stated the following in...
So you've got to, once again say that. He says that he was just being unbiased, he's presenting information and so on. So he's already conflated the idea of Marxism and has now painted it as bad. No context whatsoever, because our audience is Call of Duty players and they're just too stupid to understand what Marxism, communism, and separating economic ideologies are. We just need a bad guy. We need a boogeyman. So now he's like, he openly supports Black Lives Matter. Of course he openly supports it, because ultimately as an American who believes in the the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, which I keep saying, you should agree the fact that black lives equally matter as white lives. Why would you not? That's anti. That's just anti, bro. It's anti-patriotic, it's anti-American, and it's based on anti the values that established the state in which you are trying to glorify right now.
Early August of 2020.
I'm calling for the abolishment of history classes in Illinois. We're concerned that current school history teachings lead to white privilege and a racist society.
It's true.
This is an open call for the abolition of American history education, later defined as indefinite at least until a new, better curriculum can be constructed.
Well, you're an example of that. The fact that you can't even interpret history with a somewhat fundamental kind of like critical thinking. The fact that you've openly kind of made a video that states that Marxism equals automatically bad, without taking into consideration that you have so many comparable parallels between Stalin's Russia and the American society as it's existed. So when we're talking about obviously the conflation of that with bad societies, you cannot obviously have anything bad to say about Stalin's Russia and the Soviet Union that you wouldn't have to say about America. So it's interesting. On one hand, you're like, you hate or at least have a disdain or a disagreement, contention for the society in which Marxism is synonymous with, but have nothing to say about the United States, but criticize those who do have something to say about the United States. Ideological thinking is a cancer.
But the question is, constructed by who? The destruction of historical knowledge is a widespread tactic in the rise of new government. This has been replicated throughout history, and open advocacy for the removal of American history education, while a political movement led by Marxist community organizers.
No one's ever said removal of history. For the most part, when you research, I guess, the notion or the sentiment of Black Lives Matter, they ask for the decolonialization specifically of American history. And this is an ongoing movement in many places, the desexism of history, the inclusive nature in which we need to understand that history is written by the victor. History is written by people who, are of power at the time. So when we're talking about the historical interpretations of the civil rights movement, right? Majority of people within the 70s, the 80s, etc. probably still would have told you that they were just a bunch of troublemakers. It's only with an understanding of racial issues, racial tensions, and racial history in contemporary times that we understand that this was a propaganda ploy to dissuade any kind of sympathies or humanities towards the plight of black people during the civil rights. Similar examples obviously with apartheid as well. Apartheid is another example in which when people finally got wind of the treatment of black people, sanctions were put into place, protests were made in order to belittle the state of South Africa and its economic opportunities abroad, internationally, and what have you. And this obviously led to South Africa abolishing apartheid as a state, which was a state which automatically discriminated against people of color in order to benefit those of European origin. So you're openly calling, from this video, you are actually openly calling for an America in which panders to white supremacy, because without knowing your history, as you've thoroughly repeated in this particular point, this particular video, we have no way of trying to figure out how we've got into the situations that we have contemporary. You have to understand the nature in which African Americans have been allowed to exist. I was going to say thrive, but the existence in which African Americans have experienced can nowhere be equated to an American, portrayed existence. the land of the free, home of the brave. Like, these are people who disproportionately make up the military. These are people who signed up to, the Allied forces and went to fight during the World Wars. And when they came back, they were denied GI Bills and the ability to amass wealth in the same way that whites had been able to. So this is a really worrying take, and it shows just how America's lack of refined education in comparison to its European counterparts really does flirt with fascism.
Sweeps across the entire nation, and a simultaneous rift is exploited between the police force and the citizens they exist to protect, in direct defiance of all knowable statistics and all gathered data, all in complete alignment with the tactics that Yuri Bezmenov discussed after...
I love this whole kind of like point of information, statistics, and data. And it's like, yeah, the data basically does tell you that there is systemic racism in the police, my friend. The data does tell you that blacks are disproportionately targeted in comparison to whites for similar crimes, drug use being one of them. And just to point that out, on a Wikipedia page, which I may recommend for you, Lowering Crime, it actually demonstrates how targeting of black communities is not even just systemic, but is, it's written on paper historically. In the fact that in 2011, I believe it was, up until 2013, 2014, there was a significant decrease in the level of crime in the UK. And this was a blip on their radar because the decrease was just so significant. They had to note what the differences in the society were if they wanted to, somehow understand how they could approach decreasing crime in London, particularly where it's supposedly the most dangerous. And they found that the demand for cocaine had decreased, that the supply of cocaine was not as frequent. And this obviously led to less criminal activity, because when you don't have a component to sell and you don't have sellers to sell it to, people then aren't brought into a life of crime in order to dispense the products. So this has been an ongoing argument, especially within the UK community, where it comes to black on black crime. For the most part, drugs are predominantly a white activity in the UK, and for the most part, I believe white youths are far more likely to actually be in possession of leisurable drugs than black people. Yet black people are disproportionately targeted by the police for stop and searches, and disproportionately targeted by the police when it comes to, I guess, arrests, which lead to prosecutions. This is obviously as well because the Caribbean community in the UK is vastly affected by poverty due to the discriminations that they faced when they first arrived in the UK. Less job opportunities, less ability to amass wealth, less ability to, just be offered a mortgage. These particular instances lead to people being in the situation that they are, yet it just seems that American systems of education are just so inadequate in teaching people that some people aren't actually born naturally evil. Some people are born into a circumstance that almost dictate their future for them. That's not to say that we don't have free agency, but the fact that crime is disproportionately a symptom within poorer communities demonstrates that, we set certain people up to fail when we don't try to abolish poverty.
After his defection from a Marxist-Leninism ideologically controlled socialist/communist government, all of these things combined have transformed this simple Call of Duty trailer from an innocuous piece of marketing material to a scathing commentary on the current social-political atmosphere driven by activists all over this nation. Bezmenov warned of these many tactics, but he was not alone. Though this trailer does not specifically emulate the now historic text of 1984, authored by the late writer George Orwell, we can see shocking...
Fascists, yeah. Echelon gamers or whatever you call yourself, yeah, you are confirmed fascist. Fascists love 1984, and it's so ironic because it's almost like they've never either seen the theatrical adaptation or at least even read the book. They just know it's a book about censorship and government kind of like policing thought and everything. And they love the book when it comes to the fact that certain people are trying to correct society's kind of discrimination, sexism, racism, bigotries, homophobia, transphobia. They see that as censoring. No, my dude. The idea is that even in this, I guess, two of the main characters are basically found kind of like having sex and so on. And sex is not something that is permitted within that society. They have to sneak off in order to be intimate with each other. And then, spoiler alert for those who are listening, the lady ends up being an informant and ends up actually being someone who is trying to basically see how corruptible a person can be when they're allowed certain freedoms. So it's so funny when fascists try to use 1984 as an example of how political correctness will lead to a state of fascism, and it's meant to be a direct commentary on the institutions already in place. Idiots.
Shockingly precise, even confoundingly exact replications of his warning. The phrase 2 + 2 = 5 is used in the dystopian novel as an example of Ingsoc, or English socialism.
Or Marxism, communist equals bad.
It is an example of the party projecting messages that are intentionally untrue and contradictory as a control tactic. War is peace, truth is lies, ignorance is strength. This equation is repeated verbatim on social media by leftist advocates and even educational professors. There was a stunning compilation created which shows with detail how 2 + 2 = 5, as stated in this authoritarian dystopia, is being parroted by activists today in modern America.
I love how he's not realizing that it's meant to be a direct commentary on American society, on the fact that American feeds America half-truths because they know that Americans are too stupid to try to have some critical thinking, and of course don't have the historical kind of teachings that are decolonialized to understand that their system is thoroughly corrupt. You know, this is literal kind of like, this is like Nazi level indoctrination here. This is pretty worrying for a top level gamer who is influential on YouTube, Twitter, and probably Twitch. I'm old. This is worrying. This is very worrying. There's probably a whole ton of kids who are watching this being influenced by misinformation, a lack of historical education, and some really bad interpretations of just general, I guess, political and economic theory. This is a shit show. This is a mess.
The argument is that this mathematical standard, that mathematics itself is a colonialist and oppressive construct, which must be dismantled or transformed, and all of this aligns precisely with the greater narrative that in order to destroy a nation, to demoralize it, subvert it, and cause destruction within, you need to undermine its individual systems. The Cold War trailer alters crucial context. Yuri Bezmenov in
I don't even know how he came to that conclusion, man. The mind of the privilege is something else.
many of his lectures discusses the infiltration of not only government but also education systems. He appears to talk about an operative, a spy, or a militaristic covert infiltrator, but he is also talking about professors, educators, and wider academia. These operatives do not assail the government hierarchy, they attack and subvert the minds of the people by undermining the systems in place which give them stability and structure. These systems are numerous.
So white supremacy, racist discrimination, homophobia, sexism, a government that, promotes sexism, promotes sexual assault, promotes rape culture, are systems that give people stability. Yo, man.
Math, protection, safety, family. On the Black Lives Matter website, we can see that their mission statement includes rhetoric such as, "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure." And if we relate all of this back to a simple 2-minute Call of Duty trailer, we can see a warning with absolute clarity. This warning applies more closely to modern America.
And again, we've gone from racism to anti-LGBT now because of the fact that when they talk about the nuclear family, they talk about this enforced, and again, 1984, right? This guy is making direct links to 1984. The nuclear family is basically the standard in which America expects people to conduct themselves. And this can be seen in the fact that, you know, gay rights was not a thing until like the late 90s up into the early 2000s. So when we're talking about people's freedoms, you know, this guy's not actually talking about freedoms. He's talking about the ability to take a certain ideology and just take it in and not have any existence or, you know, experience of your own that matters outside a prescribed economical system. And that is all the nuclear family is. It's an economical system that guarantees America, you know, workers, that guarantees America taxes, that guarantees America subjugation over women, subjugation over children, and subjugation over sexuality. So it's interesting just how dense Nazis tend to be and how stupid they actually are when it comes to critical thinking. Like, if this is the level of critical thinking that children are being exposed to when it comes to, you know, early video games, and let's be honest, the majority of people playing Call of Duty are not of the prescribed age, this is worrying.
Than many people will know or ever wish to accept, and whether by design or coincidence, which it could be, Call of Duty has broken a barrier of entertainment and social reality that no previous iteration in its lineage has ever even come close to, and it did all of that with 2 minutes of footage. It remains to be seen how deep this story will go, but in a world where constant activist anger has resulted in an untold number of corporate capitulations, seeing Activision Blizzard post this message, which warns with chilling precision against the loss of history, as our very own political leaders in the country...
Again, loss of history. No. The whitewashing of history. The whitewashing of history is the loss of history.
Advocate for the destruction of historical education, watching trained Marxist self-professed community leaders advocate for the existing system to be burned down. The material in this trailer, destabilization, demoralization, disruption, and subversion from a socialist, communist, or Marxist authority is incredibly relevant. It's
just the Marxist and socialist authority, not the Proud Boys, not the Proud Patriots, not the white supremacists, not the neo-Nazis, not the KKK, who all absolutely hate American capitalism, just the socialists and Marxists, so just the black people. Man, this is like the most damning kind of evidence that this particular group is just fascist and probably harbors some really foul, racist, homophobic, and sexist people. But it's the gaming community. Who's surprised?
It seems rather obvious that this Call of Duty will encounter controversy. The mere fact that they pushed Yuri Bezmenov further towards the mainstream is already somewhat surprising, but in a world such as this, when America's social and political atmosphere is this eerily similar to the very things that he warned against all those years ago, a simple trailer becomes a ticking time bomb of outrage, with a meaning that is well and truly beyond the basic functionality of a random first-person shooter video game. Call of Duty Cold War is one to watch and will likely have numerous future controversies should it aim to incorporate more of the teachings that Yuri Bezmenov has dictated. Either way, when a certain sect of activists become aware, there may already be sparks, because the activist political organization of Black Lives Matter, supported by a political establishment...
You gotta love how throughout this commentary, the victimhood in, you know, someone who very clearly is of a privileged position. You know, the ideology that people are coming for our society and our rights and so on is very clear. There's someone who wants to maintain the system of white supremacy. He wants to maintain the system of patriarchy. He wants to maintain systems that benefit solely one group, and that tends to be white males. That everyone else can go fuck themselves. White males, all the rage. That's absolutely wicked. And he's doing all of this while obviously playing Call of Duty and just mercilessly killing bodies for the sake of entertainment and pleasure. Yo, man, this sounds like a sane motherfucking individual.
Across the country are utilizing and representing identical strategies and ideological dangers which Yuri Bezmenov fled Soviet Russia to escape, and they exemplify the very same tactics that he openly warned against till his passing on January 5th, 1993.
Racial equality, sexism, and, you know, the equality of women, LGBT rights are not things that he fled Stalinist Russia to flee, like to get away from. That is not, the conflation of the two is just so fucking anti-historical. It's ridiculous. How are you conflating the fact that people just don't want to be shot by the police because they're black with sending people to the gulags because they're not meeting work quotas for the day? It's just absolutely absurd. America, do better. Please, do better.
America is getting more and more miserable. Demoralization. Businesses flee population centers after
has nothing to do with the fact that the cost of living has gone up. Has nothing to do with the fact that education is just utterly unattainable for the majority of the masses. It's nothing to do with the fact that racism as a historical ill hasn't been addressed. Sexism in general is still prevalent in the Americas. And furthermore, our understanding of mental health issues and, you know, our openness to taking criticism now where it's paper written is a lot more acceptable now, because pretty much the governments and the people and the power at bees have sustained the system, or at least created a system in which they can just send police into Portland and quash any kind of disdain or any kind of disagreements that society has with the systems at play. So this guy's a Nazi, bro. He's actually clinically and politically a Nazi.
Violent daily rioting, destabilization, and all of this is becoming normalized after months of non-stop advocacy that the entire system must be uprooted, burned to the ground, or overthrown, which constitutes a violent change of economic and social policy.
There's no violence. The majority of Black Lives Matter activists have definitely been peaceful. In terms of obviously the aggressive protesters and stuff, that will happen. But it's funny that Black Lives Matter has now been painted, or at least fashioned in a way that everyone sees them as absolutely violent and definitely non-peaceful protesters. But when you point to people the fact that, you have a faction of white society that is purposely planning the death of people who are of, color, it's a fringe group. It's mental health. It's, radicals on the X, Y, and Z. There's never actually any kind of collective responsibility when it comes to white society and, white terrorists, or at least white home terrorists, domestic terrorists. Mainly because obviously to criticize the white cis males is to basically, destruct the whole lot of systems in which America kind of maintains and uplifts itself, and they don't want to do that now, do they?
Crisis. It's all happening right now, word for word. But that's it. If you want support, please consider subscribing on locals.com. The link is down below. It's $5 a month, but allows me to discuss topics like this without fear of YouTube censoring or subverting my channel. Other links are there as well, on other YouTubers' support, Twitter, and merch, but I'll cut it there. As always, thank you all for watching.
I'm calling for the abolishment.
YouTube really sponsoring fascism. Twitch, you're really sponsoring fascism. This is crazy. What do you think someone is going to see in this? The idea that Marxists have been targeted from day dot. And these are people who just believe in Marx's theory of quashing, systemic inequalities. These aren't people who have any affiliations with Russia and have any sympathies towards Russia. You can't be a communist or a Marxist and not be critical of Russia. It makes no sense at all. So for the most part, when we're talking about what do people do when they know someone is a communist, you just need to look at the rhetoric in America. Kill commies, that's the notion. And we're already seeing people, 60 cars or 60 people have tried to run over Black Lives Matter protesters. We've had people shoot into Black Lives Matter protesters with live rounds. We've had people come up with paintball guns, we've come up with maces, come up with pipe bombs, and this is adding to the fire. This is inciting racial hatred, violence. This is inciting people to look at the trailer of Call of Duty, realize that there's somehow some people who are trying to basically tear down American society, and you need to do something about it. But you stop short or shy of actually saying what that is. I mean, Hitler wasn't actually there at the gas chambers, for most people, just to know that. Like, he didn't really get his hands dirty either. Like, this is interesting.
Of history classes in Illinois.
Wow, so, damn. Alright, so I don't even know how far that's gone. Let me see. Damn, that is a damning video. If you ever wanted to end your career, that was it. You've basically called for people to actually take up arms and action against Black Lives Matter, because the idea is that you don't want your society, or you don't want your systems to burn down. And these are systems of discrimination, because we know this. We know that from surveys, we know that from finding out certain corruptions, certain scandals, and certain infiltrations of the police, that America is run on a system of racism and discrimination, sexism, transphobia, and homophobia. And you seem to have a problem with people addressing that in majority peaceful protest, to the point where you've now conflated the idea of Gulag Stalinism with Black Lives Matter activists. And we all know what Americans would love to do to Soviet Union operators. This is worrying propaganda, and I can't lie, like, this is an example, and a really stoic example, of the fact that YouTube seems to have problems with, you know, sexuality, women being able to express their sexuality and stuff like that, but we have no issue as a society fanning the flames of hatred, separation, targeting discrimination, homophobia, sexism, etc., to the point where it will end up in people being killed. It will end up in the direct belittlement of people's human rights because some Yahoo watched 2 minutes of a trailer. That's crazy, bro. That's crazy. Anyway, guys, please be sure to spread this message, because stuff like this cannot go unchecked. People's lives are at stake here. People's existence, people's ability to move forward in, you know, a democratic society are at stake when people like this create propaganda like this in such a high, powerful position of privilege to influence so many young minds into ideologies that are outdated, discriminatory, belittle human rights, and just downright dangerous. This ultimately may have been just a video with some crackpot conspiracy theories, but for people who are in marginalized community, this is a direct call to arms for certain people to go and target their communities. And this is unacceptable. YouTube, deal with it. Twitter, deal with it. Social medias, Twitch, deal with this, because you're gonna have blood on your hands, and I don't know how you lot sleep at night. Stay sexy.